By January 1649, England had become a country strikingly different from the island kingdom Charles I Stuart had ruled at the beginning of his reign. The Revolution, or as contemporaries called it, the Civil War, which began in 1642 with promises of parliamentary freedoms and religious purity, was concluding with an unprecedented act: the deposition and trial of an anointed king. Parliamentary forces, led by Oliver Cromwell, had achieved a decisive victory, and the former disputes between the Crown and the people had given way to a radical drive for the restructuring of society. London, once a bastion of royal power, had become a center of anti-monarchical sentiment, where public opinion, fueled by pamphlets and sermons, demanded not only limitations, but also the complete elimination of monarchy as a source of tyranny. The political landscape changed irreversibly after Charles's defeat at Naseby and his subsequent surrender to the Scots, who then handed him over to Parliament. Moderate voices, aiming for compromise and a constitutional monarchy, were silenced or entirely excluded from the political process, giving way to resolute factions such as the Independents and the New Model Army. These individuals believed that only the complete annihilation of royal power could save the nation from a return to absolutism and papism, and they were prepared to use any means to achieve this goal. The purged Parliament, having become a puppet in the hands of the army, transformed into an arena of fierce debates, at the center of which stood not merely the king's fate, but the very future of English statehood. Under the influence of the most radical elements, Parliament adopted a policy of systematic persecution of all who might pose a threat to the new order. No one was safe from accusations, not even those who had once sincerely supported Parliament's cause, but now wavered in the face of the unheard-of reprisal against the king. The trial of Charles I and his subsequent execution must be viewed within this broad context of revolutionary transformation. He was not merely a victim of personal animosity, although such animosity undoubtedly existed. Rather, he became a victim of a political system that used violence as a tool to consolidate its power and revise social foundations. The revolutionaries believed that only by completely destroying the old order could they build a new society based on their ideals of religious purity and parliamentary rule. Their resolve was bolstered by the idea that a king who infringed upon the rights of his people was a tyrant and traitor, deserving of the ultimate punishment, regardless of the sacredness of his anointed status. The international aspect of the conflict also played a decisive role in Charles I's fate. As King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, he was viewed by other European monarchies as a symbol of legitimate authority, and his salvation, though difficult to achieve, remained the hope of many of his supporters. The ongoing war in Ireland and the threat of a Scottish invasion, as well as fears of intervention by European powers such as France, provided further justification for treating him as an enemy of the state rather than merely a fallen monarch deserving of clemency. A propaganda campaign against Charles I had been waged for many years prior to his arrest. Pamphlets, engravings, and public speeches depicted him as a corrupt, incompetent, and treacherous figure, unconcerned with the suffering of the English people. These attacks were so successful that by 1649 he had become one of the most hated figures in the country, blamed for everything from initiating the Civil War to abusing power. The cultural atmosphere of the time, saturated with Puritan ideas and radical religious doctrines, also contributed to the harshness of his treatment. The revolutionaries rejected traditional notions of the divine right of kings and feudal fealty in favor of a new ethic based on God's law and the rights of subjects. In this new moral system, showing mercy to a tyrant was not an act of compassion, but a betrayal of the cause of righteousness and the suffering people of England. St. James's Palace, located in Westminster, had served as a temporary abode for monarchs for centuries, but never before had a king been held there as a prisoner awaiting trial. Originally part of extensive royal holdings, it was transformed into a place of confinement where Charles I was brought in mid-December 1648. Its ancient brick walls and high vaulted ceilings were designed for grand receptions and court assemblies, not for holding a captive monarch who once commanded armies and lived in luxury. Charles I arrived at St. James's Palace on December 19, 1648, having been transported from Windsor Castle. He was moved from the relatively comfortable conditions of royal residences to the harsh realities of confinement, albeit not to a prison cell in the usual sense. The transfer itself was significant. While Windsor allowed him some illusion of royal life, St. James was intended for his complete restriction of liberty and preparation for trial. He was allotted a room whose size sharply contrasted with his former chambers, with limited access to the outside world, serving as a reminder of his lost status. The physical conditions of his confinement, while not as primitive as a common prison, were nonetheless deliberately severe. His room contained only necessities, and the luxurious items to which he was accustomed had been removed. The presence of parliamentary guards, who constantly watched him day and night, was not only a security measure, but also a form of psychological pressure. These guards were instructed to prevent any escape attempts or communication with the outside world. They took their duties seriously, rarely allowing him a moment of privacy, even when he attempted to pray or read. The cold of the December days and the dampness of the old palace almost immediately took a toll on his health. Having spent years in the well-heated and ventilated chambers of his country residences, Charles I was unprepared for the humid and cold conditions. He began to show signs of physical decline that would characterize his final weeks. Poor sanitary conditions and limited access to fresh air further undermined his health, although he continued to maintain an outward dignity. His daily routine devolved into a monotonous cycle of meals, brief periods of physical exercise in the confined courtyard, and long hours of waiting. The quality of the food was considerably inferior to what he was accustomed to, but he ate it with surprising composure, never complaining about the privations, though he was losing weight. The psychological impact of imprisonment was perhaps even more devastating than the physical deprivations. Charles I was separated from his wife, Henrietta Maria, who by then was in France, and from his younger children, whom he was only allowed to visit shortly before his execution. He received no news of their condition and had no way of knowing if they were receiving proper care. The isolation was almost complete. Few visitors were allowed, and those who came were thoroughly vetted by the authorities. His lawyers, appointed by Parliament, would later describe the profound sorrow and resignation they observed in their client, though he never showed weakness. He seemed to understand that his fate was already sealed and that the upcoming trial would be merely an elaborate formality designed to provide legal justification for a predetermined outcome. The guards who served during his imprisonment later testified to his dignity in these incredible circumstances. Despite his evident suffering, he maintained a serene composure that impressed even those who had been indoctrinated to view him as a sworn enemy of the people. He thanked the guards for small acts of kindness and never complained about his treatment, though he had every reason to protest the conditions of his confinement. His faith, deep and unwavering, gave him the strength to endure the ordeal with true Christian humility. The trial of Charles I, which began on January 20, 1649, in Westminster Hall, constituted one of the most egregious perversions of justice in the annals of European history. The High Court of Justice, established specifically for swift justice against the king, had already demonstrated its willingness to condemn prisoners based on the flimsiest evidence and political expediency. In Charles I's case, the outcome of the trial was predetermined by political expediency rather than legal evidence, rendering the proceedings a carefully orchestrated performance designed to justify a decision already made. The charges against the king were a mixture of absurdity and political motivation. The most serious accusations included waging war against Parliament and the people of England, which was framed as treason against the state and tyranny. Nevertheless, the prosecution also included a host of minor and ludicrous assertions, including embezzlement of funds and patronage of counter-revolutionary elements. Testimony against him was mainly obtained from witnesses whose own survival depended on their cooperation with parliamentary authorities. Former servants, officers, and even casual acquaintances were brought in to provide evidence of his alleged crimes. Much of their testimony was based on hearsay, conjecture, or a deliberate misrepresentation of events that had occurred years earlier. The standards of proof that would have applied in a normal criminal proceeding were entirely abandoned. His defense, though rendered invalid by the court itself, faced an impossible task. Charles I refused to acknowledge the court's legitimacy, asserting that no court had the right to judge a divinely anointed monarch. He declared that his defense was not only for himself, but for all kings and the liberty of England. Whenever the king attempted to challenge the court's jurisdiction, he was frequently interrupted and dismissed. The public gallery was filled with spectators eager to witness the former king's humiliation. Many had waited for hours for the opportunity to see the man they blamed for their suffering brought low by revolutionary justice. Their presence created an atmosphere more akin to a theatrical performance than a legitimate proceeding, where spectators applauded the prosecution and jeered at the defense. Charles I himself maintained remarkable composure throughout the proceedings. Contemporary accounts describe him as pale and visibly worn, yet dignified in his responses to even the most outrageous attacks. He steadfastly denied all accusations of betraying his people, maintaining that he was merely a defender of his and his people's rights against the encroachments of a rebellious parliament. His serene dignity in the face of such attacks may have impressed some observers, but it did nothing to alter the predetermined outcome. The prosecution relied heavily on the interpretation of his actions and correspondence, which were either taken out of context or presented as evidence of a treasonous plot, while private expressions of concern for his family and country were twisted into proof of a counter-revolutionary design. The revolutionary authorities had no interest in distinguishing between legitimate royal duties and actual political activities. The conclusion of the trial was a foregone conclusion from the outset. On January 27, 1649, following lengthy debates in Parliament and the High Court, the verdict was delivered. Charles I was found guilty on all counts of conspiring against the public liberty and security of the nation, and of waging war against Parliament and the people of England, with the sentence of death to be carried out immediately. The swiftness of the sentence shocked even some supporters of the revolution, who had expected at least a pretense of careful deliberation. Instead, the trial served its assigned purpose, providing legal cover for a political execution that had been planned for months. The night of January 29-30, 1649, was the longest for Charles I, as he confronted the reality that his execution would occur the following morning. The death warrant had been delivered to him in the afternoon, and he was immediately returned to his chamber in St. James's Palace to await death. The brevity of time between the verdict and the execution was deliberate. The revolutionary authorities wished to prevent any rescue attempts or popular demonstrations that might unfold if he were allowed to linger in confinement. His last hours were dedicated to spiritual instruction, bidding farewell to his remaining children and preparing for death. He spent time in prayer with Bishop Juxon, who remained with him. In his spiritual testament, imbued with deep faith and humility, he wrote of forgiving those who condemned him and expressed hope that his death might bring peace to England. This document, though not immediately delivered, stands as one of the most poignant records of his final ordeal and demonstrates the remarkable spiritual strength that had developed within him during months of confinement. Bishop William Juxon, who spent these last hours with him, later testified to his coolness and dignity. Charles spent much of the night in prayer and contemplation, occasionally making notes. Despite his obvious fear and sorrow, he maintained the demeanor instilled in him since childhood, the duty of royalty to face even death with grace and courage, as befitted a martyr. Throughout this long night, sleep came only fitfully. The realization that morning would bring his death, combined with the constant presence of guards and the sounds of preparations outside his room, made rest virtually impossible. He could hear the construction of the scaffold at Banqueting House and the gathering crowds in the streets beyond the palace walls. These sounds served as a constant reminder that thousands eagerly awaited his execution. Physical preparations for the execution began even before dawn. His hair, which had grown long during months of confinement, was recombed and secured under a thin cap to ensure nothing would impede the executioner. This final act, to be prepared for death like a sacrificial animal, represented the complete dehumanization that the revolutionaries sought to impose upon their victims. He was no longer a king, not even merely a man, but simply a body, to be processed by the machinery of revolutionary justice. His request for the bishop to accompany him to the very scaffold was granted. This was perhaps the sole act of mercy afforded him in his final hours. Breakfast, served on his last morning, consisted of simple bread and a glass of wine, a meager meal that underscored the dramatic shift in his circumstances from the elaborate morning routine of a royal court. He ate little, having lost much of his appetite during months of confinement. His hands did not tremble as he brought the glass to his lips. He maintained an incredible composure despite the dread he must have felt as the moment of his execution approached. As dawn broke on January 30, 1649, Charles I faced the reality that he would not live to see the next sunset. The man who once awoke in silk sheets, surrounded by servants and courtiers, now prepared to face death in a damp room, watched by hostile guards. The transformation from king to condemned man was complete in less than 7 years. At 10 a.m. on January 30th, 1649, representatives of the High Court of Justice arrived at St. James's Palace to begin the final preparations for the journey to the scaffold. The process was designed to maximize his humiliation and demonstrate the complete triumph of parliamentary justice over royal prerogative. Every detail was meticulously planned to ensure his last moments served as a powerful symbol of the new order's victory over the old. Charles I left the palace on foot, surrounded by guards, and walked through St. James's Park to the place of execution outside Banqueting House. He wore a simple black coat over a white shirt. This path, about half a mile long, was specifically chosen so that the king could be seen by thousands of people. His hands were not bound, but his freedom of movement was constrained by a tight ring of soldiers, as well as the frosty weather, which made every step difficult. This physical discomfort was not as obvious as in the case of another monarch, but it was part of the deliberate humiliation. The revolutionaries wanted him to visibly suffer as he made his final journey through the streets of London, demonstrating to the crowd that even kings could be reduced to the level of common criminals. The route from St. James's Palace to Banqueting House was carefully selected to maximize the public spectacle of his downfall. The procession passed through the open park, ensuring that thousands of citizens would have the opportunity to witness the former king's final journey. Mounted guards and foot soldiers surrounded the king, both to prevent any rescue attempts and to maintain order among the crowds lining the streets and frozen trees. The crowds that gathered to watch him pass displayed a mixture of curiosity, hatred, and celebratory triumph that shocked even some contemporary observers. Many people brought their children to witness the historic event, viewing the execution of a king as a form of entertainment and education. Vendors sold food and drinks to spectators, creating a carnival-like atmosphere that starkly contrasted with the solemnity of the event. Contemporary accounts describe Charles I's demeanor during this final journey as remarkably serene. Despite the taunts and insults hurled at him by the crowd, he maintained an upright posture and looked straight ahead, refusing to give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him break. He walked at a brisk pace, eager to reach the execution site as quickly as possible to avoid prolonging the suffering. This dignity, in the face of such degradation, impressed even some of his enemies who had expected him to collapse under the pressure of public humiliation. Artists, like the journalists of the time, documented his final walk. Engravings depict a man who appears older than his 48 years, with a weary but unwavering expression, yet still possessing an unmistakable bearing of majesty despite the desperate circumstances. These images became some of the most powerful visual testimonies to the impact of the revolution on its victims. The journey took about 2 hours, during which Charles I was subjected to constant verbal abuse from the crowd. People shouted accusations, curses, and threats, creating a cacophony of hatred that must have been overwhelming. Many observers noted that he seemed to be praying silently for much of the walk, his lips moving as he sought solace in his faith during these final moments of life. The scaffold, specially constructed in front of Banqueting House in Whitehall, had been transformed into an amphitheater of death by the time Charles I arrived around 1 p.m. It was covered in black cloth, and the axe, stained dark to conceal bloodstains from previous executions, lay on the block in the center. Thousands of spectators gathered in the square and on surrounding rooftops, creating a sea of faces eager to witness the final act of the royal drama. The scaffold itself was elevated so that everyone in the crowd could witness the execution clearly. This elevation served both practical and symbolic purposes. It allowed for better crowd control and also emphasized the public nature of revolutionary justice. The executioner and his assistant, whose identities were concealed by masks, had carried out numerous executions during the Civil War, but it would later become known that the king's execution was the most difficult of their careers due to the immense pressure and public attention. When the king reached the foot of the scaffold, he was helped to ascend it. Contemporaries noted that he seemed unsteady on his feet, whether from weakness, fear, or the effects of his long imprisonment. His simple black coat and white shirt stood in stark contrast to the elaborate dress he had worn at the beginning of his reign. The crowd pressed closer, eager to witness every detail of his final moments. The ascent of the scaffold steps proved difficult for the king. Months of poor nutrition and limited exercise had significantly weakened him, and the steep wooden steps required assistance from the executioner's assistants. At the top of the scaffold, he addressed the crowd in a loud voice, proclaiming his innocence and forgiving his enemies. "I shall not make excuses for what I have done. I shall only say that I defended the rights of the people. I die innocent of all crimes for which I am accused. I forgive those who are the cause of my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed may never fall upon England." He spoke of dying for the liberty and laws of England, but not for the liberty to take power into their hands. His serene dignity in the face of such degradation impressed even some of his enemies, who had expected him to collapse under the pressure of public humiliation. Some contemporary sources describe an instant silence that fell upon the crowd as they realized they were witnessing a truly historical moment: the execution of a king of England, an event that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The final preparations for the execution were carried out with efficient brutality. His coat was removed, leaving him in his shirt to avoid impediment to the axe, and he voluntarily laid his head on the block. The positions of the executioner and his assistant on the scaffold were with practiced precision, having performed this ritual countless times before. Despite their experience, the gravity of the moment did not escape their attention. This was not just another criminal, but a man who had once ruled England. In his final seconds, Charles I reportedly looked at the crowd gathered to witness his death. What thoughts crossed his mind in these last moments can only be imagined. Perhaps memories of his children, thoughts of his wife who was in exile, or reflections on the dramatic changes that had transformed England from a kingdom to a republic. The contrast between this moment and his coronation in Westminster Abbey as God's anointed monarch could not have been more stark. At 1 p.m., at a signal, the axe blade fell, ending the life of Charles I and closing one of the most dramatic chapters in English history. The approving roar of the crowd was immediate and loud, a sound that echoed through the streets of London and marked the symbolic end of the old regime. The man who once believed in his divine right now became another victim of the revolution he had unwittingly helped to create. The final days of Charles I revealed truths about human nature and political power that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of the English Revolution. His story demonstrates how quickly established orders can collapse when they lose popular legitimacy. But it also shows the terrible human cost of political transformations achieved through violence and vengeance. The man who died on January 30, 1649, was both a symbol of oppressive privilege and a human being whose suffering moved even his enemies. The legal proceedings that led to his execution expose the dangers of politicized justice and predetermined outcomes. When courts become instruments of political will rather than impartial arbiters of evidence, it inevitably leads to both injustice and the corruption of the legal institutions themselves. The High Court of Justice's handling of Charles I's case became a template for show trials that would plague political systems for centuries, suppressing dissent in the name of revolutionary purity. His dignified conduct during imprisonment and execution stands as a striking example of grace under extreme pressure. Despite all attempts to humiliate and break his spirit, he maintained a composure that impressed even his jailers and executioners. This dignity became part of his historical legacy and contributed to the ultimate restoration of his reputation, proving that how a person faces adversity can be as important as the adversity itself. The international repercussions of his execution demonstrated the interconnected nature of European politics and the impossibility of containing revolutionary movements within national borders. His death helped transform what might have remained an English civil conflict into broader European political and religious debates that would persist for many decades and fundamentally alter the continent's political landscape. The propaganda surrounding his trial and execution illustrates the power of narrative in shaping historical memory. The competing stories told about his life and death, tyrant versus innocent victim, show how the same events can be interpreted radically differently, depending on political perspective and historical context. Truth becomes malleable when political necessity demands a particular interpretation of events. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Charles I serves as a warning about the human capacity for cruelty when political passions override moral restraints. The crowds that cheered his execution were not inherently evil people, but ordinary citizens whose legitimate grievances had been channeled into destructive hatred. Their jubilant enthusiasm for his death reminds us how quickly the veneer of civilization can disappear when society embraces violence as a solution to political problems. The revolution that consumed him was itself consumed by its own violence, and many of those who condemned him eventually faced the same fate. This pattern of revolutionary movements devouring their own children became a recurring theme in subsequent political upheavals, suggesting that once violence becomes normalized as a political tool, it becomes increasingly difficult to control or contain. In the end, the last days of Charles I shed light on the eternal tension between justice and mercy, between collective will and individual rights, between political necessity and human decency. His death marked not only the end of a king, but also the beginning of a new understanding of how far a society will go in pursuit of its ideals, and what is lost by abandoning the moral principles that make those ideals worth pursuing.